In the town of Günzburg, there is a factory. The machines kept rolling out for decades through the 1970s, the 1980s, and into the 1990s. Workers clocked in, shifts changed, and the name stamped into every chassis, printed on every catalog, was never removed. That name was Mengele. Not a coincidence, not a distant relative. The same Mengele who stood on the ramp at Auschwitz in the dark, a white-gloved finger sorting thousands of human beings into two lines, immediate death or slower death. The same Mengele who drew a chalk line on the wall of the children's barracks. If your head reached the line, you went to the medical block. If you fell short, he kept you alive a little longer, so he could watch you grow into his next experiment. Inside that block, he injected chemicals directly into the eyes of children, awake, strapped down, no anesthetic. He was trying to dye blue irises brown, to prove through children's pain that race could be manufactured. The infections ate through corneas. Some went blind. Others died of sepsis while he filled his notebooks. He sutured twin toddlers together, back to back, veins cut, flesh joined, attempting to create conjoined twins by hand. He dissected living infants and compared organ weights. He shot prisoners in the head to study their skulls before their body went cold. Then the war ended, and Josef Mengele did not hang, did not stand trial, did not spend a single day in a cell. He walked out of Germany with false papers, a new name, quiet assistance of people who knew exactly who he was. Mossad hunted him. Wiesenthal tracked him. Survivors waited for a justice that never came. And every year of his escape, the Mengele name rolled openly through the German countryside, stamped on the side of tractors, printed in trade catalogs, displayed at agricultural fairs. A family business, a family fortune, a family silence. He wasn't hiding in a jungle. He was hiding inside that silence. This is not the story of one man who escaped justice. This is the story of the town that never asked, the factory that never closed, the family that never gave him up. It begins in Günzburg, where no one talked about the past. To understand how Josef Mengele died a free man, you have to understand what he was born into. In 1907, in this town of 12,000 people located next to the Danube River, a man named Karl Mengele took over a small foundry and workshop. Within a generation, it had grown into a company manufacturing agricultural machinery, threshers, balers, seeders, equipment to feed a nation. The name above the gate, Karl Mengele and Sons. Within a decade, the factory was the artery of Günzburg. You didn't simply work for the Mengeles. You lived in their shadow. The local economy moved at their rhythm. The name on the factory wall was the most consequential name in the region. Josef Mengele grew up wearing the factory like a second skin. He watched his father's workers. He absorbed the lesson of power, that it flows toward the man whose name is on the building, and away from those who answer to that name. But Josef was not interested in machines. He was interested in people, specifically in the idea that people could be sorted. By the time Josef left Günzburg to study medicine and anthropology at Munich, his father had also made another decision. Years before Hitler ever held power, Karl Mengele had already thrown the factory gates open to him. And the moment Hitler seized control of the country, Karl didn't hesitate to make it official. He joined the Nazi Party. The factory that would later bankroll one of history's most wanted criminals had already opened its gates to the man who made those crimes possible. At this point, the early 1930s, Josef was still just a promising academic, a rich boy with a theory. What that theory would demand of him, and of the family behind it, was something nobody in Günzburg admitted to understanding. They understood. By the time Josef Mengele arrived at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt, the intellectual groundwork for genocide was already being laid in peer-reviewed journals. His mentor, Professor Ottmar Freier von Verschuer, had a theory. Identical twins held the genetic key to understanding inherited traits. Isolate what makes twins different from each other, and you understand what makes races different from each other. You understand how to engineer a master race. For von Verschuer, it was an academic exercise. For Mengele, it was a calling. In 1943, while millions of people were being forced onto trains across Europe, Josef Mengele did something that tells you everything you need to know about the man. He volunteered for Auschwitz. He wasn't required to go. He held the decoration, the Iron Cross, and a war wound that exempted him from frontline duty. He had a prestigious academic posting. He could have spent the war in comfort, but he had seen something in the intelligence reports. The trains arriving at Auschwitz carried Jews from across Europe, hundreds of thousands of them. And among those hundreds of thousands were surely thousands of twins. His laboratory was waiting. He arrived in May 1943. He was 32 years old. He would work at Auschwitz for 19 months. What he did in those months cannot be fully told here, and should never be minimized by the telling. But there is one thing you must understand before the story continues. He was not a reluctant participant. He was not a man following orders. He feared to disobey. He was enthusiastic. Eva Moses Kor. She was 10 years old when the train from Romania arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in the spring of 1944. She was holding her twin sister Miriam's hand. What Eva remembered 60 years later was the chaos of the ramp, the screaming, the searchlights, the German voices giving commands she couldn't parse. Then, a surge in the crowd, and her mother was gone, pulled away, lost in the mass of bodies pressing forward. Eva Moses Kor, speaking decades later. I turned around and they were gone. I never saw them again. Eva and Miriam were 5 feet from the entrance to the gas chamber when a prisoner spotted them. 2 identical girls clinging together, and shouted a word in Romani that would save their lives for now. Twins. The word passed from prisoner to guard to the officer in the white coat, standing at the far end of the ramp. With an evil grin on his face, Mengele approached the twins. He crouched down to the girls' height. He tilted their faces toward the light. He compared their features with the careful attention of a man assessing materials. He was almost gentle. Josef Mengele said, "Zwilling raus," means twins step forward. It was a death sentence that arrived wearing the face of a rescue. But Eva and Miriam didn't know that yet. They were taken to the twins' block, given food, allowed to keep their clothes. The other children there called this man Uncle Mengele. Mengele injected Eva with an unknown substance. She developed a fever so violent, her temperature so high, that he came to her bedside, not from concern, but to document the rate of deterioration. Eva Moses Kor said, "I promised myself I would survive, to prove him wrong." She did survive. Miriam survived too, though the damage Mengele had done to her kidneys would eventually kill her in 1993, 48 years after the liberation. But Mengele was already moving on, always moving on, recording, comparing, dispatching. He injected chemicals into children's eyes to try to change their color, to manufacture the blue eyes his ideology demanded. He performed surgeries without anesthetic. When one twin died during an experiment, the other was killed immediately, so their organs could be examined side by side in a simultaneous autopsy. He wasn't a rogue madman acting in secret. He was a state-funded researcher, mailing jars of eyes and vials of blood back to academic institutions in Berlin. When the Red Army began to close on Auschwitz, Mengele packed his research notes into 2 briefcases, abandoned 700 skeletal prisoners to the liberation, and walked into the snow. The world spent the next 34 years trying to answer one question: where did he go? The answer would be far more infuriating than anyone expected. His name, for now, was Fritz Hallmann. Before sunrise, on mornings in 1946, 1947, and 1948, Josef Mengele walked the fields of a farm near the village of Mangelding, roughly 30 miles from his family's factory in Günzburg, turning soil and harvesting crops for a farmer named Georg Fischer. Neighbors saw a quiet, helpful farmhand. Educated, perhaps, kept to himself. Didn't say much about where he'd come from. In the first chaotic weeks after the war, Mengele had been swept into a prisoner of war camp. His name was already on the earliest Allied wanted lists. The things he had done at Auschwitz were being documented by survivors and entered as evidence at Nuremberg. But the U.S. Army was processing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, and their primary method of identifying SS members was a single physical check, a blood-type tattoo that the SS stamped on the arm of every member. Mengele had refused to receive the SS tattoo. He'd considered it an affront to the physical perfection he was obsessed with maintaining. His arm was unmarked. They let him walk, and so for 4 years, while Nuremberg tried and executed his commanders. World burned with the revelations of what had been found inside the camps. The angel of death harvested potatoes 30 miles from home. His family knew exactly where he was. Letters arrived, money arrived, messages from Günzburg passed through trusted intermediaries. And when investigations began to close the circle in 1949, another message arrived from the factory. It was time to run. The question now wasn't whether Mengele could escape. The question was, who was going to pay for it? In the years after the war, a network of escape routes for wanted Nazis took shape across Europe. Church corridors, forged papers, border crossings greased by ideological sympathy and fear of Soviet communism. History would call them the Ratlines. Mengele acquired a Red Cross passport under the name Helmut Gregor, arranged through ex-Nazi contacts and sympathetic church intermediaries. He traveled to Genoa. On May 25, 1949, he boarded a ship called the North King, bound for Buenos Aires, Argentina. Buenos Aires in 1949 was a sanctuary for the worst men in Europe. Adolf Eichmann was already there. Klaus Barbie had passed through. Hundreds of former SS officers were quietly constructing new lives in the suburbs of a city that had been encouraged by its own government to ask no questions. Mengele settled in quickly. He spoke Spanish well. He moved in circles of German expatriates who knew or suspected exactly who he was. He bought a stake in a pharmaceutical company. He drove a car and attended dinner parties. And back in Günzburg, the factory was thriving. West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was remaking the country at breathtaking speed. The Mengele Company was producing tractors and farm equipment for a Europe desperate to feed itself after a decade of war. The profits were enormous. A careful, systematic portion of those profits was being redirected through third parties and couriers to a man in Argentina calling himself Helmut Gregor. The profits from the family company were helping one of the world's most wanted men stay free. Then Mengele did something so brazen it almost defies comprehension. He went back to Europe 7 years after fleeing to Argentina, 7 years after his name appeared on international wanted lists, 7 years after survivors of his experiments were testifying at trials, describing what he had done to them when they were children. In 1956, Josef Mengele traveled to Switzerland for a skiing holiday. He met his son Rolf there. He met his sister-in-law Martha. He traveled under documents bearing his real name. He even applied for and received a new West German passport, formally issued under his actual identity. How was that possible? In 1956, the Federal Republic of Germany was in a peculiar position. Many of its courts, intelligence services, and government ministries were staffed by men who had served under the Third Reich. Former Nazis sat on the benches of courts tasked with prosecuting Nazi crimes. Former SS officers worked inside agencies responsible for tracking down former SS officers. In many cases, the machinery of accountability was being operated by people who had once been part of the very system under investigation. Mengele returned to Argentina, feeling safer than he had in years, and in Günzburg the factory continued. The workers clocked in. The name stayed on the wall, and the silence that had settled over the town grew thicker, more practiced, more deliberate with each passing year. That silence was about to be shattered, but not in the way anyone in Günzburg was hoping. The year everything changed. The man's name was Adolf Eichmann. He had coordinated the logistics of the Holocaust, the train schedules, the deportation orders, the bureaucratic paperwork that moved millions of people to their deaths. He had been hiding in Buenos Aires for a decade, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory under the name Ricardo Clement. He was 15 seconds from his front door when three men stepped from the parked vehicle. Israeli Mossad agents, led by Operations Officer Rafi Eitan, intelligence analyst Zivi Aharoni. Team that had spent months tracking their target, successfully abducted Adolf Eichmann from Argentina and brought him to Israel. There he was put on trial, convicted of crimes against humanity, and executed in 1962. The message to every surviving Nazi hiding in South America was unmistakable. They are coming for you. When Josef Mengele learned what had happened, he panicked. He abandoned the comfortable life he had built in Buenos Aires and disappeared. First to Paraguay, then to Brazil. The apartment was gone. The business connections were gone. His dinner party days were over. In their place came safe houses, false identities, shrinking circle of loyal sympathizers willing to shelter him without asking questions. Simon Wiesenthal had survived Mauthausen concentration camp. He had lost 89 members of his family to the Holocaust. After liberation, while the world attempted to move forward, Wiesenthal made a different choice. He would not move forward. He would remember every name, trace every trail, follow every lead until the men responsible stood in a courtroom. Wiesenthal received reports about Josef Mengele throughout the 1960s and 1970s. A sighting in Paraguay, a rumor of a farm in Brazil, a contact who knew someone who had passed a man matching his description on a dirt road outside Sao Paulo. Each led to the next, and always, just before the circle closed, Mengele was gone. In Germany, international pressure finally forced a reckoning. In 1972, formal warrants were issued. Journalists descended on Günzburg. They brought cameras. They knocked on doors. What reporters found in Günzburg was a town that seemed to fold inward at the mention of Josef's name. Shop owners who suddenly needed to attend to something else. Neighbors who had seen nothing, heard nothing, known nothing for 30 years. When the family spokesperson was asked directly, "Do you know where Josef is?" the answer came quickly, smoothly, without hesitation. Karl-Heinz Mengele, speaking to journalists, said, "We have no contact. We have had no contact for years." It was a lie, not a clumsy lie, a rehearsed one. Declassified intelligence files from the West German BND, released decades later, would prove what Wiesenthal suspected all along. The family not only knew where Mengele was, they had been sending him a courier. Hans Sedlmayr was a senior manager at the Mengele factory, a trusted insider, a man who had worked for the family for decades. From the early 1960s onward, Sedlmayr made regular trips to South America. He brought cash. He brought letters. He brought news from Günzburg. He was the invisible wire connecting the factory to the fugitive, the living supply chain that kept Josef Mengele alive and free. Seldmeier wasn't an outsider, brought in to do a dangerous job. He had known Josef since they were boys, growing up together in the shadow of the same factory gates. The Mengele family hadn't simply assigned the job to whoever was available. They had chosen, deliberately, the one man whose loyalty went back further than the business itself. Someone who grasped the stakes. Someone who would carry the secret for exactly the same reasons Josef needed it kept. The factory employed hundreds of ordinary workers who had no knowledge that their company's profits were being redirected to harbor a war criminal. Men and women who worried about their mortgages and their children's schooling. Ordinary people doing ordinary work. They were innocent of the secret. But the sign above them, the name Mengele, flew like a flag over all of it. The hunters were closing in. But so was time. By the 1970s, Josef Mengele was deteriorating, not morally. The evidence suggests he never experienced the remorse that might have made that word meaningful. But physically, worsening eyesight, an ear condition, arthritis, the cumulative damage of decades of stress and displacement. His final years were documented in letters he wrote to his son, Rolf. Letters full of self-pity and persecution of a man who regarded himself as a victim of historical misunderstanding. In one letter, Mengele referred to his time at Auschwitz as the work, not as a crime, not as a catastrophe. As work he had performed correctly, that the world had simply failed to appreciate. Eva, Moses Kor, Miriam, and the hundreds of children he had treated as experimental material were, in his accounting, not victims. They were data, variables, residue of a scientific program that history had interrupted. He never expressed regret, not once. Not in any document that has been found. On February 7, 1979, Josef Mengele went swimming. He suffered a stroke in the water. He drowned. A local woman named Elsa Gulpian de Oliveira found his body on the shore. He was buried in a small cemetery under the name Wolfgang Gerhard, an Austrian Nazi sympathizer whose identity Mengele had borrowed years earlier. The grave was unmarked in any way that would draw attention, and the family said nothing. For 6 years, while Simon Wiesenthal searched, while survivors waited, children of Auschwitz grew old carrying what he had done to them inside their bodies. The Mengele family sat in Günzburg and kept their secret. The factory kept running. In 1985, a joint West German, Brazilian, and American investigation finally broke the family's wall of silence. The key was Hans Sedlmayr. Investigators raided his home in Günzburg. In his personal files, they found what 6 years of international searching had failed to locate: letters, addresses, a correspondence that had been maintained carefully for more than 2 decades. The letters led to the Stammer farm in Brazil. The Stammer farm led to a cemetery in the town of Embu das Artes, and the cemetery led to bones. The forensic team, led by American expert Clyde Snow, spent months analyzing the skeletal remains, the skull measurements, and the dental records. The bone structure consistent with a man born in 1911 who had fractured his pelvis in a motorbike accident years before. It was him, Josef Mengele, the angel of death, the most wanted man on earth, had died a free man on a beach, in the sun, 6 years before anyone outside his family even knew. No trial, no sentence, no moment of reckoning, just bones in the Brazilian heat. And in Günzburg, even as the world confirmed what the family had known all along, the factory continued. The sign remained. The name remained. The silence remained. Because it had worked, and silence, once it has worked, becomes very difficult to disown. The Carl Mengele und Söhne company collapsed in the late 1990s. Not from justice. No court ever reached them. Not from accountability. The statute of limitations on aiding a fugitive had long since expired in West Germany. The family was never charged. The company simply ran out of road. Bankruptcy. Liquidation. Its assets absorbed into other agricultural conglomerates. Its name eventually vanishing from catalogs and letterheads in the sides of tractors. But consider what that sign had meant. For those decades it stood. A family that knew with precision where the world's most wanted war criminal was hiding. A family that handed the job of keeping him hidden to one of their own. A childhood friend turned company man, trusted precisely because his loyalty predated the business itself. A family whose profits, generated by the honest labor of hundreds of ordinary workers, were systematically redirected to protect a man who had selected children for torture. And a family whose name stayed on a building, on equipment, on civic life, on the identity of a town that had collectively decided not to look too hard at what that name required. Eva Moses Carr survived Auschwitz. She spent decades as a witness, speaking to schools, to parliaments, to documentary crews, to anyone who would listen. She returned to Auschwitz multiple times, to stand on the ramp where Mengele had crouched to examine her face in the torchlight. She was asked once whether she knew that Mengele's family had funded his escape, had maintained his freedom for decades, had kept the secret of his death for 6 years while survivors continued to search. She knew. And she said, "The worst thing is not that he escaped. The worst thing is that the world let the names stay on the building." Josef Mengele died in 1979. He was never arrested. He was never convicted. He never spent a single day in prison for what he did at Auschwitz. And that may be the most disturbing part of the story. Not that a mass murderer escaped, but that so many people helped him do it.
The history we're taught is only the surface. What lies beneath is much darker. We're just opening the archives. Subscribe to Magnify History and join us as we bring the past to light.